The rusted ladder rungs crumbled beneath Detective Sarah Chan's boots as she descended into the abandoned grain silo, her flashlight cutting through the musty darkness. 22 years of secrets were about to surface, and she could feel it in her bones. But nothing could have prepared her for what waited at the bottom of a child's red toy truck, pristine as the day it vanished, sealed inside what should have been an empty concrete tomb. The call had come in at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. That started like any other. Margaret Henley, now 78 and suffering from early-stage dementia, had been wandering her deceased husband's property when she stumbled upon something that made her scream until the neighbors came running. The old grain silo, abandoned. Since the farm went under in 2003, had developed a crack in its concrete wall. And there, visible through the fissure, was a flash of red that stopped Margaret's heart. "That's Tommy's truck," she whispered to Officer Rodriguez when he arrived. "My grandson's truck, the one he had the day he disappeared." Thomas Tommy Henley had been 7 years old when he vanished from his grandparents' apple orchard on October 15, 2001. The search had consumed the small town of Millbrook Hollow. For months, drawing volunteers from 3 counties and making national headlines. FBI agents had trampled through the cornfields. Bloodhounds had followed scent trails that led nowhere. And psychics had claimed to see visions of the boy in places ranging from Mexico to Canada. But Tommy had simply evaporated, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Now, as Detective Chan photographed the toy truck with trembling hands, she noticed something else glinting in her flashlight beam. A small piece of fabric, blue denim, caught on a protruding bolt 15 feet above the silo floor. Her stomach dropped. Someone had been up there. Someone small. The case had haunted Detective Chun since she joined the Millbrook Hollow Police Department 8 years ago. Tommy's file was the thickest in the cold case cabinet, filled with witness statements, search records, and the desperate pleas of parents who never stopped looking for their son. Sarah had grown up in the neighboring town of Cedar Falls, just 30 miles away, and she remembered the Amber Alerts, the missing child posters taped to every store window, the way parents suddenly held their children's hands a little tighter when they went to the grocery store. Now 34, and the department's lead detective, Sarah had reviewed every page countless times, searching for the thread that would unravel the mystery. She'd interviewed aging witnesses, followed up on tips that had gone cold, and even consulted with retired FBI profilers who'd worked the original case. Tommy Henley had become her white whale, the case that defined her career and kept her awake at 3 in the morning, staring at crime scene photos and wondering what she'd missed. Back at the station, she spread Tommy's case files across her desk like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle she'd been trying to solve her entire career. The original investigating officer, Detective Frank Morrison, had retired 5 years ago after 32 years on the force, but his notes were meticulous to the point of obsession. Morrison had treated Tommy's disappearance like a personal crusade, working 18-hour days and following leads across 4 states. His dedication had earned him commendations from the state police and recognition from the National Center for Missing Children, but it had also cost him his marriage and his health. Tommy had been visiting his grandparents for the weekend, something he did every few months since his parents' bitter divorce 6 months earlier. The custody battle had been vicious, with accusations of infidelity, substance abuse, and emotional manipulation flying from both sides. His mother, Linda Henley Martinez, had remarried a construction foreman named Carlos Martinez and moved to Phoenix, while his father, David Henley, worked oil rigs across North Dakota and Montana, chasing high-paying jobs that kept him away from home for weeks at a time. The divorce had torn Tommy apart, according to school counselors and family friends. The bright, outgoing boy had become withdrawn and anxious, struggling with nightmares and bedwetting. His grades had slipped from A's to C's. and he'd been caught lying to teachers about bruises that his parents claimed came from playground accidents. The weekends at his grandparents' farm had become his refuge, the one place where he could still be a carefree child. Robert and Margaret Henley had raised 5 children on their 40-acre farm, and their house had always been filled with the laughter of grandchildren. Robert, 72 at the time of Tommy's disappearance, was a quiet man who communicated through actions rather than words. He taught his grandchildren to fish in the pond behind the barn, to identify different types of birds, and to understand that hard work was the foundation of a good life. Margaret was the storyteller, the keeper of family history, the one who made sure everyone felt loved and fed. The boy had been picking apples with his grandfather on that crisp October morning, working to fill bushel baskets for Margaret's famous apple pies. The Henley orchard had been in the family for 3 generations, 50 trees of various heirloom varieties that produced some of the best apples in the county. Tommy loved climbing the sturdy branches, reaching for the perfect specimens that grew highest on the trees. Robert had been worried about letting him climb so high, but the boy was nimble and confident, and Margaret had argued that children needed to take some risks to build character. They'd been working since sunrise, with Tommy chattering constantly about school, his friends, and his plans for Halloween. He'd wanted to be a policeman that year, complete with badge and handcuffs, because policemen catch the bad guys and keep everyone safe. The irony of that choice would haunt his family for years to come. Then Tommy asked to use the bathroom. Around 10:30, Robert had pointed him toward the farmhouse without looking up from his ladder. The old man's arthritis was acting up that morning, making every movement painful, and he was focused on getting the picking done before the weather turned. When Tommy didn't return after 30 minutes, Robert assumed the boy had gotten distracted by something inside, maybe cartoons on television, or the batch of cookies Margaret was baking. It wasn't until Margaret called from the kitchen, asking where Tommy was because lunch was ready, that Robert realized something was wrong. The boy's footprints were clearly visible in the soft soil, leading from the orchard to the house, but they stopped at the edge of the gravel driveway. It was as if he'd been lifted straight up into the sky. Sarah picked up the phone and dialed Linda Martinez's number in Phoenix. The conversation was always painful, filled with Linda's sharp intake of breath when Sarah described finding the toy truck. Over the years, Sarah had called Linda dozens of times with updates, false leads, and the heartbreak of dead ends. Each call reopened wounds that never fully healed. He carried that thing everywhere, Linda whispered through tears that were both fresh and 22 years old, even slept with it. Said it was his lucky truck because his daddy gave it to him before one of his trips to the oil fields. He used to push it around the house making engine noises, pretending he was driving to see his father at work. Linda's voice broke as she continued. After the divorce, Tommy became obsessed with that truck. The child psychologist said it represented his connection to David, his hope that his father would come back. When Tommy disappeared, I kept thinking maybe he'd taken the truck with him wherever he went, like it would protect him somehow. She paused, struggling to compose herself. Finding it means he's really gone, doesn't it? It means he's been gone this whole time. The next call was harder. David Henley had never recovered from his son's disappearance, though his descent into guilt and alcohol had been gradual rather than dramatic. In the immediate aftermath, he'd taken leave from his job and thrown himself into the search with manic energy. He'd printed thousands of flyers, driven to every truck stop and rest area within a 500-mile radius, and offered a $10,000 reward that represented his entire life savings. But as the weeks turned to months, with no trace of Tommy, David had begun to unravel. He'd started drinking heavily, first to sleep, then to function. He'd gotten into fights with reporters, screamed at FBI agents who suggested they might be dealing with a runaway rather than an abduction, and finally driven Linda away with his. Accusations that she'd hidden Tommy to hurt him in their custody battle. Now David lived in a cabin outside Fairbanks, Alaska, working sporadically as a hunting guide for tourists who wanted to experience the wilderness. Getting him on the phone required 3 attempts through his employer, and even then, the connection was filled with static from the satellite phone. "You found what?" David's voice was rough, weathered by years of regret and alcohol. When Sarah explained about the silo, about the truck, David went silent for so long she thought the line had gone dead. "I need to come home," he finally said, his voice breaking. "I should have been there. I should have been there that day, instead of working. I should have protected my boy." Sarah had heard these self-recriminations before, in every conversation she'd had with David over the years. The man had convinced himself that his absence during the divorce proceedings, his focus on work instead of family, had somehow caused Tommy's disappearance. No amount of logical argument could shake his belief that he was responsible for his son's fate. While waiting for the parents to arrive, Sarah drove back to the Henley property with crime scene technician Jake Morrison, Frank Morrison's nephew, who'd followed his uncle into law enforcement. Jake was 28, methodical, and blessed with the kind of attention to detail that made him invaluable in forensic investigations. He'd grown up hearing stories about Tommy Henley from his uncle, and the case had shaped his decision to specialize in missing persons investigations. Margaret was in the early stages of dementia, but her long-term memory remained sharp on good days. Sarah found her sitting on the porch swing that Robert had built 40 years earlier, staring at the orchard where her grandson had vanished. The old woman's hands shook slightly as she folded and refolded a faded yellow tea towel, a nervous habit she'd developed since Robert's death 2 years earlier. "Tell me about that day, Mrs. Henley," Sarah said gently, settling into the wicker chair beside the swing. "Take your time. Tell me everything you remember, even if it seems unimportant." Margaret's eyes grew distant, focusing on something beyond the present moment. Tommy was so excited about those apples. We were making pies for the church bake sale, and he kept saying he was going to pick the biggest, reddest ones for Grandma. He'd been looking forward to it all week, calling me every night to ask about the weather, whether the apples would be ready. She paused, her fingers working the tea towel. Robert was getting too old for those ladders, but he wouldn't admit it. His arthritis was terrible that morning. I'd given him extra pills with his breakfast. But Tommy was like a little monkey, scrambling up to get the high branches. He had such energy, such joy in everything he did. What happened when he went to the bathroom? He ran toward the house, but then... Margaret frowned, pressing her fingers to her temples as if the memory was painful. There was something else, a sound, like machinery starting up. I was in the kitchen, making tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches for lunch, and I heard it through the window. But when I looked out, I didn't see anything unusual. This was new information, or at least information that hadn't been properly documented. Sarah checked the original case files. No mention of machinery sounds in any of the witness statements. Either Margaret's memory was playing tricks, colored by 22 years of grief and guilt, or this crucial detail had been overlooked in the chaos of the initial investigation. "What kind of machinery sound, Mrs. Henley? Like a car engine?" "Aye." "Tractor?" Margaret closed her eyes, concentrating. "More like dot, 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 like an elevator, or a conveyor belt. Mechanical, but not a car. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, then stopped." She opened her eyes, looking directly at Sarah for the first time. "I should have gone to check." "If I'd gone to check, instead of finishing lunch, maybe." "It's not your fault," Sarah said firmly. "Whatever happened to Tommy, it's not your fault or Robert's fault. You were taking care of him the best way you knew how." But even as she said the words, Sarah felt the familiar chill that came with significant revelations. Mechanical sounds, lasting 30 seconds. In a rural area where the nearest neighbor was half a mile away, any unusual sound should have been investigated immediately. The fact that it had gone unnoticed or unreported suggested either innocuous explanation or something more sinister. Sarah walked the property with fresh eyes, studying the layout with Jake's help. The Henley farm was situated on a hill, with the farmhouse at the highest point and the various outbuildings, barn, chicken coop, equipment shed, arranged in a rough semicircle below. The apple orchard occupied the southern slope, where the trees would get maximum sun exposure. To the north, a property bordered state forest land. To the east and west were other farms, though the nearest occupied houses were significant distances away. The grain silo stood about 200 yards from the house, hidden by a grove of maple trees that had grown wild since Robert's farming days ended. It had been built in the 1960s, when Robert's father had expanded the farm operation to include grain crops, but by 2001, it hadn't been used in years. The external ladder leading to the top was rusted and missing several rungs no 7-year-old could have climbed it alone, even if he'd been athletic and adventurous like Tommy. But Sarah noticed something that bothered her. The silo was positioned at the edge of the Henley property, right on the boundary line with the adjacent parcel. If someone had wanted to access it without being seen from the house, they could have approached from the neighboring land and remained. Completely hidden. Jake was examining the base of the silo with a magnifying glass, looking for any evidence that might have survived 2 decades of weather. "Detective," he called, "you need to see this." Sarah joined him at the concrete foundation, where Jake was pointing to faint markings in the aged concrete. "These look like tire tracks," he said. "They're old, but not old enough to be from when the silo was operational. Maybe 10, 15 years." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Could they be from maintenance vehicles? Someone checking the structure for safety issues? Possible, but look at the pattern. These are from a personal vehicle, probably a pickup truck. And see how deep they are. Whatever was in the truck was heavy. Heavy enough to make significant impressions even in concrete this old. They photographed the tire impressions from every angle, though Sarah knew the chances of getting useful forensic information after so many years were slim. Still, it was evidence that someone had been using the silo for something, long after it should have been abandoned. That evening, Sarah met with Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the county coroner, at the morgue. Elizabeth was 52, a former big city medical examiner who'd moved to rural Minnesota after burning out on urban violence. She'd handled every suspicious death in the county for the past 8 years, and her expertise in forensic pathology had helped solve dozens of cases that might otherwise have gone cold. They'd found no human remains in the silo during the initial inspection, just the truck and a piece of denim fabric. But Dr. Warren had discovered something troubling during her detailed examination of the silo's interior. "Look at these scratch marks," Dr. Warren said, projecting enlarged photographs onto her office wall. "They're concentrated around what would be chest level for a small child, but they continue much higher up to about shoulder level for an adult." Sarah studied the photographs with growing unease. The scratches were deep, desperate, carved into the concrete with something sharp enough to leave permanent marks. What could make marks like these? Fingernails initially, but also metal objects maybe. A belt buckle, buttons, anything someone might have used to try to climb out. The pattern suggests repeated attempts over a long period of time. Sarah's heart sank as the implications became clear. How long could someone survive in there? Depends on airflow, temperature, access to water. The silo isn't completely sealed. There are gaps in the construction that would allow some air circulation. But Sarah, Dr. Warren hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "These marks aren't 22 years old. The concrete powder residue, the way the edges have weathered, I'd estimate they were made much more recently, maybe 5, 6 years ago at most. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. If the scratch marks were recent, it meant someone else had been in that silo. Someone who might know what happened to Tommy Henley. Or worse, someone who might have been involved in keeping secrets buried for over 2 decades. There's something else, Dr. Warren continued, switching to another set of photographs. I found traces of organic material embedded in some of the scratches. Hair fibers, skin cells. I've sent samples to the state lab for DNA analysis, but the results won't be back for several weeks. Sarah stared at the photographs, trying to process what she was seeing. You're telling me someone was trapped in that silo recently enough to leave biological evidence? That's exactly what I'm telling you. And based on the height and pattern of the scratch marks, it wasn't a child. The next morning brought David Henley back to Millbrook Hollow for the first time in over a decade. Sarah met him at the small municipal airport, barely recognizing the broken man who shuffled off the chartered plane. David had once been tall and strong, the kind of man who worked with his hands and carried himself with quiet confidence. He'd been handsome in a rugged way, with thick dark hair and a kind of smile that had attracted Linda when they were high. School sweethearts. Now he was gaunt, his face carved with lines of grief and guilt. His hair had gone completely gray, and his hands shook with the tremor of someone who'd used alcohol to numb pain for too many years. He moved like a man much older than his 51 years, as if the weight of his regret had bent his spine. 22 years, he said as they drove toward town through the familiar landscape of rolling hills and farmland. 22 years I've been running from this place, and my boy was here the whole time. We don't know that yet, Mr. Henley. The truck being there doesn't necessarily mean don't. David's voice was sharp, cutting through Sarah's attempt at comfort. Don't give me false hope. I buried my son a long time ago in my heart, Detective. Finding that truck just makes it real in a way I'm not sure I can handle. Sarah understood his defensiveness. She'd worked enough missing persons cases to know that families developed coping mechanisms that allowed them to function despite unbearable uncertainty. Some held on to hope so tightly it became delusion. Others, like David, chose the certainty of grief over the torture of not knowing. Tell me about the truck, Sarah said. When did you give it to Tommy? David's expression softened slightly. It was his 6th birthday. I'd been working a job in Wyoming for 3 months. Missed his birthday party. Missed everything important. As usual. When I came home, Linda was barely speaking to me, and Tommy ... his voice cracked. Tommy had stopped asking when Daddy was coming home. He stared out the window at the passing countryside. I bought that truck at a gas station on my way back from Wyoming. It wasn't expensive, just a little die-cast model of the kind of truck I was driving for work. But when I gave it to him, his whole face lit up. He said it meant Daddy would always be with him, even when I was gone. Sarah felt the familiar ache that came with these intimate details of families torn apart by tragedy. Did he play with it? Often? Every day. He'd carry it in his pocket to school, sleep with it under his pillow. Linda used to get frustrated because he wouldn't put it down long enough to eat dinner properly. David managed a bitter smile. She said I'd created a monster, giving him something that made my absence feel present. But I was gone so much, I wanted him to have something that connected us. Linda Martinez arrived that afternoon, accompanied by her second husband, Carlos, and their teenage daughter, Maria. Sarah picked them up at the Minneapolis airport, noting how much Linda had changed since the last time they'd met in person 3 years earlier. She was 48 now, her brown hair streaked with gray, her face carrying the weight of a mother who'd never stopped mourning her lost child. Carlos Martinez was a solid, reliable man who'd married Linda knowing he could never replace Tommy. In her heart only help her learn to live with the loss. He'd spent 15 years competing with the ghost of a 7-year-old boy, and somehow managed to build a stable, loving family despite the shadow that Tommy's disappearance cast over everything. Maria, now 17, had grown up hearing stories about the brother she'd never met. Linda had been pregnant with Maria when Tommy disappeared, and the stress of the search and investigation had nearly caused her to miscarry. Maria had been born into a family still reeling from trauma, raised by parents who were simultaneously overprotective and haunted by the knowledge that children could simply vanish. The reunion between Linda and David was awkward, filled with the weight of shared tragedy and mutual blame. They hadn't spoken in 15 years, not since David had accused Linda of hiding Tommy during a drunken phone call that ended their last attempt at communication. The divorce had been finalized while Tommy was still missing, adding legal complexity to an already unbearable situation. "You look terrible," Linda said bluntly when she saw David at the police station. "You look older," David replied, not unkindly. Sarah gathered everyone in the conference room for a formal interview. She needed to review every detail of that October day, looking for inconsistencies or forgotten memories that might shed new light on Tommy's disappearance. After 22 years, witness memories were unreliable, colored by time and trauma, but sometimes the passage of years allowed people to remember details they'd initially suppressed. "Walk me through the morning," Sarah said, her digital recorder. Running and Jake taking notes. "Start from when Tommy woke up." Linda's voice was steadier than Sarah expected, though she clutched Carlos's hand throughout the interview. He was so excited. He'd been looking forward to visiting Grandpa and Grandma all week, talking about it constantly. "We drove up Friday night. It was about a 4-hour drive from Minneapolis, where we were living then. He could barely sleep Friday night, kept asking when morning would come so they could pick apples." "What time did the apple picking start?" "Around 9, David said, his voice hoarse. "I was there too that weekend. It was one of the few times I wasn't working." His voice carried decades of regret. "We had 3 ladders set up in different parts of the orchard. Tommy was working the low branches, filling his bucket with the apples he could reach from the ground and the bottom rungs." "Was anyone else helping with the harvest?" Linda and David exchanged glances. "There were usually volunteers from the church," Linda said slowly. "Dad Henley Robert, he donated apples to the church bake sale every year, and people would come help with the picking. But that morning, it was just family," David finished. "Mom Margaret had mentioned that several people were supposed to come help, but they'd canceled. I think there was some kind of conflict at the church, people taking sides in some argument about the new pastor." Sarah made a note. This was information that hadn't been in the original files, or at least hadn't been emphasized. If the usual crowd of volunteers had canceled, it meant fewer people around, fewer potential witnesses, and fewer adults keeping track of Tommy's whereabouts. "And then?" "He said he needed to go to the bathroom," Linda continued, her voice beginning to waver. "It was around 10:30. Dad pointed him toward the house. We kept working." She paused, tears streaming down her face. "We kept working. We didn't even watch to make sure he made it to the house safely. We were so focused on getting the apples picked before the weather turned bad." Sarah made notes, comparing their account to the original statements. Everything matched so far, but she was looking for details that might have seemed unimportant 22 years ago, but could be significant now. "Mrs. Henley mentioned hearing machinery that morning. Do any of you remember that?" The 3 adults exchanged glances. David frowned, concentrating. There was old equipment scattered around the property. Could have been anything: a generator, maybe a chainsaw from a neighbor's property. Dad had an old tractor that would backfire sometimes, when the wind was right. Or the grain elevator, Linda said suddenly, her eyes widening as the memory surfaced. Remember, David? There was that old grain elevator system that Dad never got around to removing. It made terrible noises when the wind caught it just right, like metal grinding against metal. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Show me. They drove to the Henley property as a group, Margaret included, despite her protests that she was tired and confused. The old woman seemed more alert today, perhaps stimulated by having her family around her. But she kept asking why so many people were at her house, and when Robert was coming back from town. When they reached the grain silo, Margaret's demeanor changed completely. She became agitated, backing away from the structure and shaking her head. No, she said firmly, her voice carrying an authority that cut through her usual confusion. We don't go near the silo. Robert always said it was dangerous. The grain elevator could start up by itself sometimes, especially on windy days. He said if anyone ever fell in there, we might not find them for days. Sarah examined the silos, exterior more carefully than she had during her initial inspection. Sure enough, there was evidence of an old mechanical system, rusted pulleys, a corroded motor housing, and a network of pneumatic tubes that once moved grain from ground level to the top of the silo for storage. The system had been shut down years ago, but the machinery remained, a complex network of moving parts that could theoretically still function if someone knew how to operate it. Could this system have been operational in 2001? Sarah asked David. I don't know. Dad was always tinkering with old equipment, trying to fix things instead of replacing them because he couldn't afford new machinery. It's possible some of it still worked, even if it wasn't being used regularly. Jake was examining the mechanical components with the focused attention of someone who understood how things worked. Detective, he called from behind the motor housing. You need to see this. Sarah joined him at what appeared to be a control panel, protected from weather by a metal housing that was partially rusted away. Inside, she could see switches, gauges, and wiring that looked more recent than the rest of the equipment. This system has been modified, Jake said, pointing to newer wiring that had been spliced into the original electrical system. Someone's done electrical work on this within the last 10, maybe 15 years. Professional work, not just amateur tinkering. Sarah felt cold fingers of dread creeping up her spine. Modified how? Hard to say without taking it apart, but it looks like someone installed a remote activation system. See these newer wires? They lead to what looks like a radio receiver. Someone could operate this machinery from a distance. The implications were staggering. If the grain elevator system could be operated remotely, it meant someone could have activated it from hiding, used it to move something or someone into the silo without being seen. The mechanical sounds Margaret had heard could have been the system operating, lifting Tommy from ground level to the top of the silo. They climbed to the top of the silo using a modern ladder brought by the fire department. The opening was covered by a heavy metal hatch that required 2 men to lift. Sarah peered into the dark interior, her flashlight illuminating the concrete walls where someone had scratched desperately, trying to escape. If someone fell in here, she said, could they get out on their own? Not a chance, said Fire Chief Tom Radley, who'd responded to Margaret's original call. That hatch weighs at least 200 pounds. Once it's closed, you're not opening it from the inside. And even if you could somehow get it open, it's a 20-foot drop to the bottom. Anyone who fell in here would be trapped. But Sarah was thinking about the modified elevator system, about remote operation, about someone who could control access to the silo from a distance. What if they didn't fall in? What if they were put in there deliberately? The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Everyone stared into the dark interior, imagining the unthinkable, a 7-year-old boy trapped in this concrete tomb, scratching at walls until his fingernails bled, calling for help that never came. As they prepared to leave, Sarah noticed Something else, fresh tire tracks leading to and from the silo area. The tracks were too clear to be 22 years old, maybe a few months at most. Someone had been here recently, someone with access to the property who knew exactly where they were going. That evening, Sarah interviewed the neighbors systematically, starting with the families who'd lived in the area longest. Most of the residents were farmers or retirees, people who'd known the Henley family for decades and had participated in the original search for Tommy. The Kowalski family lived closest to the Henley farm, on a property that shared a quarter-mile border with Robert's land. Mrs. Kowalski, now in her 80s, remembered the day Tommy disappeared with startling clarity. "Such a commotion," she said, serving Sarah tea and homemade cookies in her cluttered kitchen. Police cars, search helicopters, reporters from the Twin Cities. It went on for weeks. My husband Jerome was still alive then, and he spent every day out there searching through the cornfields and woods. "Did you see or hear anything unusual that morning before Tommy disappeared?" Mrs. Kowalski thought carefully, her weathered hands wrapped around her teacup. "There was a truck on the Henley property, not one I recognized. White, maybe blue, hard to tell from the distance. It was parked near those trees by the old silo." Sarah's pen stopped moving. "A truck? Did you tell the police about this in 2001? "Oh, yes. I told that nice Detective Morrison. He wrote it all down in his little notebook, said they were looking into it, but I never heard anything more about it." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She'd read Morrison's case files cover to cover. There was no mention of an unknown truck on the property. Either the information had been lost in the chaos of the investigation, or Morrison had deliberately omitted it from his official reports. "Can you describe the truck in more detail?" "It was older, maybe from the 80s. Had one of those extended cabs, and there was something written on the side, like a business name or logo. I couldn't read it from my house, but I remember thinking it looked official, like a work truck." "What time did you see it?" "Early morning, maybe 9:30 or 10 o'clock. It was there when I went out to feed the chickens, and gone by the time I came back in for lunch." This timeline was crucial. If Mrs. Kowalski had seen an unknown truck on the property around the time Tommy disappeared, it represented the first potential lead in 22 years. More disturbing was the possibility that this information had been deliberately suppressed by the investigating officer. Sarah visited 3 more neighbors that evening, gathering a clearer picture of the morning. Tommy vanished. The Hendersons, who lived a mile south of the Henley farm, remembered hearing machinery sounds around 10:30, consistent with Margaret's account and the timeline of Tommy's disappearance. "It was unusual," Mrs. Henderson said. "We knew the Henleys didn't do much farming anymore, so hearing machinery from their direction was odd. My husband thought maybe they'd rented out their land to someone for harvest." The Pattersons, longtime residents who'd moved away in 2005, returned Sarah's call from their retirement home in Florida. They remembered the white truck as well, and added a disturbing detail: they'd seen the same vehicle on the Henley property several times over the months leading up to Tommy's disappearance. "We thought maybe Robert had hired someone to help with maintenance around the farm," Mrs. Patterson said. "He was getting too old to handle everything himself." And Margaret mentioned they were thinking about selling some of their equipment. By the time Sarah returned to the station that night, she had documented sightings of an unknown work truck on the Henley property from multiple witnesses, all of whom claimed to have reported the information to Detective Morrison in 2001. None of this information appeared in Morrison's official case files. Unable to sleep, Sarah called Morrison's home number. The retired detective answered on the 3rd ring, his voice groggy but alert. "Sarah? What's wrong? It's nearly midnight." "Frank, I need to ask you about the Tommy Henley case. I've been interviewing neighbors, and multiple witnesses say they reported seeing an unfamiliar truck on the property the day Tommy disappeared. There's no record of these reports in your case files. The silence stretched too long. When Morrison finally spoke, his voice was different, careful, guarded. It's been 22 years, Sarah. I can't remember every detail of every interview. This isn't a detail, Frank. This is multiple witnesses reporting a potential suspect vehicle at the scene. How does information like that not make it into the official files? Maybe I followed up on it and determined it wasn't relevant. Maybe witnesses were mistaken. Maybe a lot of things. Sarah felt her frustration building. Frank, I've worked with you for 8 years. I know how thorough your reports are. You document everything, no matter how seemingly insignificant. The idea that you'd ignore multiple witness reports of an unknown vehicle is impossible to believe. Drop it. Morrison's tone was sharp now, carrying an edge of something that might have been fear. Some cases aren't meant to be solved. Some stones are better left unturned. What the hell does that mean? It means there are things about this town, about that case, that you don't understand. Things that are bigger than one missing boy. Walk away, Sarah. For your own good, walk away. The line went dead. Sarah stared at the phone, her mind racing. Morrison knew something more than that. He was afraid of something. His warning hadn't sounded like the concern of a mentor protecting a younger colleague. It had sounded like a threat. Unable to let it go, Sarah drove back to the Henley property. In the middle of the night, using her flashlight, she walked the area where Mrs. Kowalski would have seen the mysterious truck, looking for any evidence that might have survived 2 decades of weather and neglect. The grove of maple trees provided perfect cover. Someone could have parked there without being seen from the house or the main road. The ground was soft enough to preserve impressions, even after years of rain and seasons changing. Sarah swept her flashlight across the earth, searching for anything that might confirm the neighbors' accounts. Her beam caught something faint, a set of parallel grooves, barely visible, partially overgrown with moss and grass. They were consistent with tire tracks, though time had nearly erased them. She crouched, brushing away dirt with gloved hands, and found a small rusted metal fragment embedded in the soil. It looked like part of a license plate screw, the kind used on older vehicles. She bagged it carefully, knowing it might be nothing or everything. Back at the station, Sarah couldn't shake Morrison's cryptic warning. She pulled his old personnel file, looking for anything that might explain his reaction. Frank Morrison had been a decorated officer, respected by the community and his peers. But there were gaps in his record, unexplained leaves of absence in the early 2000s, vague references to personal matters. One note caught her eye. In 2002, Morrison had been reprimanded for conducting unauthorized surveillance on a local business owner, a man named Gerald Whitaker, who ran a small construction company in Millbrook Hollow. The reprimand was light, more of a warning than a punishment, and no further details were provided. Whitaker's name wasn't in Tommy's case file, but Sarah remembered seeing it in passing during a review of property records. His company, Whitaker Construction, had done work on several farms in the area during the late 1990s and early 2000s, including repairs on the Henley silo in 1998. Could Whitaker's company be connected to the truck Mrs. Kowalski and the Pattersons had seen? Sarah pulled up the county's business registry. Whitaker Construction had dissolved in 2004, shortly after the Henley farm went under. Gerald Whitaker himself had died in 2010, but his son Nathan still lived in town, running a mechanic shop on the outskirts. Sarah drove to Nathan Whitaker's shop the next morning, a squat cinder block building cluttered with car parts and oil-stained rags. Nathan was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered with a guarded demeanor. His hands were calloused, his face weathered from years of hard labor, but his eyes flicked nervously when Sarah mentioned the Henley case. "I was just a kid back then, Detective," Nathan said, wiping his hands on a rag. My dad's company. Did some work for the Henleys. Sure. Fixed up their silo, patched some cracks. But that was years before the boy went missing. Did your father ever mention anything unusual about the Henley property? Anything about the silo or its equipment? Nathan hesitated, his jaw tightening. Dad didn't talk much about his jobs. He was a workhorse, not a storyteller. Said the Henleys were good people, paid on time. That's about it. Sarah pressed further, mentioning the white truck with a logo seen on the property. Nathan's expression didn't change, but his hands stopped moving, the rag twisting tightly in his grip. Lots of trucks around here look like that. Could have been anybody's. She left the shop with more questions than answers, but Nathan's unease stuck with her. He was hiding something, and she'd learned to trust her instincts when people got cagey. Back at the station, she cross-referenced Whitaker Construction's records with vehicle registrations from 2001. The company had owned 3 vehicles, including a white 1987 Ford F250 with an extended cab, registered to Gerald Whitaker. The truck had been sold in 2003, but the buyer's information was missing another dead end, or perhaps another detail Morrison had failed to document. Sarah's next stop was the county archives, where old building permits and maintenance records were stored. She spent hours combing through dusty files until she found a 1998 permit for Whitaker Construction's work on the Henley silo. The job had involved reinforcing the concrete walls and upgrading the grain elevator system with new wiring and a modern control panel, exactly the kind of modification Jake had noticed. The permit included a handwritten note from Gerald Whitaker, requesting approval to install a remote operation feature for the elevator, citing efficiency for future maintenance. The request had been approved without question. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture was still incomplete. If the grain elevator had been modified for remote operation, someone could have used it to move Tommy into the silo, either accidentally or deliberately. The scratch marks Dr. Warren found suggested someone else had been trapped there more recently, possibly an adult involved in covering up the original crime. But why? And how had Morrison missed or ignored so many critical details? Sarah decided to confront Morrison again. She drove to his small cabin on the edge of town, where he lived alone since his divorce. The lights were on, but no one answered the door. She circled the property, peering through windows, and noticed something odd. A stack of old case files on his kitchen table, some with Henley written on the labels. Morrison had taken case materials home against protocol for a retired Officer Dot. She called for backup, and within 20 minutes, Jake and 2 uniformed officers arrived. They entered the cabin through an unlocked back door and found Morrison sitting in his living room, a bottle of whiskey half empty on the table, his service revolver in his lap. He didn't look surprised to see them. You couldn't leave it alone, could you? Morrison said, his voice slurred but steady. I told you, Sarah, some things are better left buried. Tell me about the truck, Frank. Tell me why you buried witness statements. Tell me what you know about Gerald Whitaker. Morrison's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might reach for the gun. Instead, he took a long swig from the bottle. Whitaker was a bad man. Not the kind you arrest, the kind you avoid. He had money, connections, and a temper. Did jobs for people who didn't ask questions, and in return, they protected him. Protected him from what? From things like this. From people like you, digging where you shouldn't. Morrison leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. Tommy Henley wasn't supposed to be in that silo. It was an accident. Whitaker was doing a side job, moving some ... materials for a client. The elevator system wasn't supposed to be active that day, but something went wrong. Tommy must have been playing nearby, got caught in the machinery. Sarah's blood ran cold. You're saying Tommy was killed accidentally, and Whitaker covered it up? Morrison nodded slowly. I found out a year later, after chasing leads. That didn't add up. Whitaker came to me and fessed just enough to keep me quiet. Said if I pushed, people higher up would make sure I lost everything: my badge, my family, my life. I had a wife back then, Sarah. A daughter. I made a choice. You chose to protect a murderer? Sarah's voice trembled with anger. It wasn't that simple. Whitaker wasn't working alone. There were others, people with power. I didn't know who, but I knew they could ruin me. So I buried the truck sightings, steered the investigation away from the silo. I thought it was over, that Tommy was gone, and nothing could bring him back. What about the scratch marks? The ones from 5 or 6 years ago? Morrison's face crumpled. That was Whitaker's son, Nathan. He started asking questions about his. Dad's old jobs got too close to the truth. Someone, probably one of Whitaker's old clients, locked him in the silo for a few days to scare him into silence. He got out, but he's been quiet ever since. Sarah's mind raced. Nathan Whitaker's nervous demeanor at the shop made sense now. He'd been trapped, threatened, and likely terrified into keeping his father's secrets. But Morrison's confession raised another question. Who were these powerful people protecting Whitaker, and why? Before she could press further, Morrison reached for his gun. Sarah drew her own weapon, shouting for him to stop, but he didn't aim at her. Instead, he pressed the barrel to his temple and pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed in the small cabin, and Morrison slumped forward, lifeless. The aftermath was a blur: officers securing the scene, paramedics arriving too late, Sarah giving a statement while Jake handled the paperwork. Morrison's death was ruled a suicide, but his confession opened a Pandora's box of questions. Sarah returned to the station and began pulling every record connected to Gerald Whitaker and his construction company. Bank statements showed large, unexplained deposits from a shell corporation in the months before and after Tommy's disappearance. Property records revealed that Whitaker had purchased a small parcel of land adjacent to the Henley farm in 2000, sold it in 2004, and the buyer was another shell company. Sarah interviewed Nathan Whitaker again, this time with a warrant and 2 officers for backup. Faced with Morrison's confession and the mounting evidence, Nathan broke down. He admitted his father had been involved in illegal activities, moving stolen goods, possibly drugs, through the Henley silo for a network of clients who operated out of Minneapolis. The grain elevator's remote operation system had been installed to move contraband discreetly, but on the day Tommy disappeared, something had gone wrong. Nathan didn't know the details. His father had never told him, but he believed Tommy had been caught in the machinery, killed instantly, and his body hidden to avoid an investigation that would expose Whitaker's operation. Nathan had been locked in the silo in 2017 after confronting one of his father's old associates, a man named Victor Crane, who still ran a trucking company in the Twin Cities. Crane had threatened to kill Nathan's family if he ever spoke about what he'd learned. Terrified, Nathan had stayed silent, even as the guilt consumed him. Sarah tracked down Victor Crane, a burly man in his 60s who operated a fleet of trucks that moved goods across the Midwest. Under pressure from a joint task force with the state police, Crane confessed to his role in the cover-up. He'd been paid by a Minneapolis businessman whose identity he refused to reveal to ensure a silo remained untouched after Tommy's death. The businessman had ties to local government, enough influence to keep the investigation focused away from the Henley property. The case broke open from there. DNA results from the silo's scratch marks confirmed Nathan Whitaker's presence, corroborating his story. No trace of Tommy's remains were found, likely because they'd been removed years ago to prevent discovery. The state police raided Crane's trucking company, uncovering records of payments linking him to a network of corruption that reached into the mayor's office and beyond. Sarah stood in front of the silo one last time, watching as forensic teams dismantled the grain elevator system piece by piece. Linda and David Henley were there, holding each other despite years of pain and distance, mourning the son they'd lost to a machine and a web of greed. Margaret sat in her porch swing, too frail to join them, whispering to herself about apples. And her grandson's smile. The case wasn't fully solved. Too many powerful figures remained untouchable, their names buried in layers of shell companies and political protection. But Sarah had done what she could. She'd given the Henleys answers, however painful, and exposed a truth that had been buried for 22 years. As she drove away from the Henley farm, Sarah glanced at Tommy's case file on the passenger seat. It was closed now, but it would never leave her. Some cases never did.